beautiful.
Hello lovers of the world, this is Cinta speaking. I love listening to new music. It's really fun to find new things to obsess over, whether that's a new album, a new artist, or a new song. I am always trying to chase that sense of joy and triumph of finding something new to love. It is once again time to reflect and rank every album and EP that I listened to in the past few weeks. So this video is gonna cover what I listened to in August. Before I get to ranking, I'm going to cover my tier list grading system first, but if you are familiar with how I go about things, or if you just want to skip straight into the tier list ranking, you're welcome to skip ahead using the timestamps in the description. And if you want to skip to a specific album or EP, you can also use the timestamps in the description to navigate to whichever one you want to listen to the most. The highest tier in my tier list is called Year-End List Material. This tier is specifically for releases that came out this year. This is a way for me to keep track of the new projects that came out and to remind myself to look back on these releases when the time comes at the end of the year to make my year-end list. Only releases that came out in this year are allowed because those are obviously the only ones I will consider for my list. Meanwhile, in other tiers, any album or EP from any year can be put in them. However, just because I put an album or EP in this tier doesn't mean that they are automatically going to be on the list. They are just candidates for the final version. The difference between this tier and the one below that is that these albums have a distinct je ne sais quoi that firmly places it in this time period. Either these albums are significant in the sense that they were part of a cultural moment, thus making them ubiquitous in my life, or that I have formed a specific personal attachment to the music. It could be that it is tied to a event or a feeling that I had at some point in the year, so that in the future when I think of this album, I will not be able to disentangle it from the year that it was released in. To put it simply, these are albums that made me sit up and say, wow, this is one of the best things I've heard all year. The tier below that is called French Toast. So these are albums that are perfectly enjoyable. This is the highest an album can be placed in if that album was not released this year, but this is also the tier where I would put albums that even though I really enjoyed, I don't think I will be considering for the end of year list for whatever reason that might be. However, if that album was released this year and is placed in this tier or the ones below that, I do want to say that they always have a chance of moving up to year-end list material if I end up changing my mind. Nothing is set in stone with my tier list. I am very flexible when it comes to changing personal tastes. And I will mention it if I change my mind down the line. The tier below that is called Gems Found in the Mind. So these are albums that have a few treasured tracks that stood out to me that I find very memorable and I will keep in my heavy rotation and thus will remind me that this album exists. And I would have no problem finding praise for this album or have no qualms with recommending it to somebody else. The main difference between this tier and the one below that, which I've called the most album ever, is that so I have nothing against the album in this tier itself. I would find it to be a decent or pleasant enough listening experience, but ultimately has no memorable tracks that will remind me that this album exists, unlike the albums in the tier Gems Found in the Mind. In fact, albums in this tier are those that I would actually forget that I've listened to because of how little they have changed me as a person. The tier below that I've called, well, I learned something new. So I'm always down for expanding my horizons and I like to stay updated on releases. But if that album doesn't hit, then that's just that, it doesn't hit. However, I am grateful to the album for teaching me something, whether that's something new about the album's genre or the album's artist, or even just about myself and how I felt about this new music. I really appreciate a learning experience that music can provide. The albums that I place in this tier are those that I feel have a level of effort and sincerity that I can very much recognize and respect that I just can't say the same for the albums in the very last tier, the eggs you break for your French toast, which is a more positive way of saying that in your search for music that you can love, music that you can put in your French toast tier, you will just come across music that just doesn't resonate as much, and that is okay. It's a more positive way of saying that I really didn't like the music, but I at least gave it a shot. I always hesitate to call an album bad because I find when it comes to personal taste, all the things that you dislike about something are all the reasons why somebody else might love that same thing. However, something about this project would make me feel like it was a waste of time. Whether or not the person meant it in all sincerity or placed a lot of their heart and soul into it, the way I feel about the album renders that irrelevant. That's how negative my response has to be for me to put an album in this tier, which I seldom do, because again, I try to be very forgiving when it comes to music that I'm not familiar with or music that I am actively trying to engage with. But sometimes I do come across music that makes me kind of frustrated that I even bothered to try in the first place. Now, as a disclaimer, just because I put an album or EP in this bottom tier doesn't mean that I hate that artist. Depending on the context, it might even be the first time that I'm listening to that person. And I'm always willing to give an artist a second shot before I make my final decision. I am just grading this particular release. As you can see from the way that I've organized and structured my tier list, my reviewing style relies entirely on how I feel about an album. I don't have any musical theory background. I don't know anything about music writing or composition or production. If I know nothing else about music, I at least know how it makes me feel. But of course, I hope that I've made the tier list self-explanatory enough that you can still follow along without having to listen to my very in-depth description. But now that that's out of the way, let me share with you what I listened to recently. Everything here is in the order that I've listened to in. First, I listened to This Is For by Twice. This was released in 2025. So Twice is a K-pop girl group that dominated the K-pop genre since 2016 and continues their reign as the biggest girl group in the world. They are currently on tour, and most recently the group headlined at Lollapalooza just a few weeks after they released their new studio album. I watched that recorded live stream online and they were excellent performers. Their set was a perfect mix of the singles that built up their career, though modified through a live band to fit their image and to also cater to the audience they had at Lollapalooza, alongside the new songs in the album that best fit the Lollapalooza crowd. This huge Lollapalooza show was the only reason I can think of as to why this most recent album is so heavy-handed with the English songs. Since 2022, honestly, Twice have been trying to break into the Western pop market, and they are just chugging along with that plan. However, I find that this is the album that has just the most, not only the most English lyrics songs, but also the most Western sounding featured there. I think in this way they are trying to go up against a group like Cat's Eye, who though are younger in the game, in the K-pop school of clean choreography and perfect performances, while singing in English and having a more diverse lineup. So Twice are really trying to adapt fast. I do worry that if the company continues giving the group Western pop demos, that Twice will eventually lose what made them unique as a K-pop girl group. I think it's interesting that Twice had set so many of the trends and standards that we recognize as a staple in the K-pop genre, and for the Western pop genre to kind of go and copy that, and for Twice to copy the Western genre back again is kind of a really interesting Ouroboros of copying that we kind of just have to deal with if you're a fan of pop music like I am. If you are a fan of pop music, I think you'll find that this album is a pretty decent, solid project. The title track, This Is For, is pretty catchy and has grown on me significantly since I first heard it. Originally, I did not like it. I rolled my eyes at the super general lyrics. Personally, I'm not looking for Shakespeare when I listen to K-pop songs or even pop songs in general. What I like to look for is cleverness, intentionality, and subtlety if possible. Songs like This Is For make me feel like I am being hit in the head repeatedly with a frying pan that has the word #DivaGirlBoss inscribed on it. I do like the inclusion of Miami bass being incorporated into Twice's repertoire, and over time I grew to overlook the lyrics and just enjoy it for the fluffy fun times that it brings me. And besides, who can resist that beautiful dance? This is for all my ladies. The rest of the album is full of Western pop demos that were possibly intended for other pop musicians, which is really a good way to hijack other pop musicians' global audience to get and siphon that into Twice's side. For example, Let Love Go reminded me of a Dua Lipa track. Talk and Seesaw are clearly Ariana Grande coded. Goat and Right Hand Girl kind of has a Tyla/Rihanna-esque quality to it, and it's an odd fit for a group like Twice, who have never really made sexiness a feature in their music. And though they try their best, it makes me feel like it's not quite what they were meant to do, or that they need more, I guess, time for that to settle in the minds of their audience, if that makes sense. The implication of being given so many of these demos is that they're trying to tell their new audience that you don't need to follow other pop girls when Twice can do it all for you. However, on the downside, it kind of makes me feel like Twice doesn't really have a distinct identity from everyone else if they're so willing to grab the scraps of everyone else. But as an album, I think it is, again, pretty solid. I like the track order. I love it when there's a level of intentionality. I think From Talk to Seesaw to Heartbreak Avenue is a really good way of transitioning moods and genres and ideas from one to the other. I really like that the mood or the ideas that we started off with in the beginning is not the same ones that we end with. So again, it shows that there's a narrative kind of being told, or an attempt at telling a narrative. My favorite songs are This Is For, Right Hand Girl, That Ooh, That Ah, which has Sana's really addictive chorus. It's so deliciously seductive. I really think that's one of the highlights of the album, especially because it is such a different thing to what she usually does. I'm gonna put this album in French toast. And then I listened to Soft Era by Yves. This is an EP that was released in 2025. So Yves is a South Korean solo artist that debuted in 2024. She got her start as a member of the K-pop girl group Luna, who sadly disbanded in 2023. And since then, Yves has only released solo music. This is her third EP, and with only 6 tracks, I think I can do a quick track-by-track commentary. I think we have time for that. So I found this to be a fairly enjoyable EP, as already hinted by the excellent choice of the pre-release single White Cat. I loved that song. I think it's super catchy. There's something so charming about her grammatically incorrect English. I think it subverts the idea that it hinders one's communication skills because while it's not grammatically correct or following the rules of the language, it feels like it gives the power to the audience to interpret the lyrics however they want to, or even bestow the listener the duty of deciphering the lyrics, because they are really confusing if you just look at it on a surface level, and I really don't understand what the song is supposed to be about. Comment down below if you've listened to the song and you have your own interpretation of what it means. I did not actually go and listen to any interviews or read up on what Yves might have said about the title track, because I really like to receive the text uninhibited by that. But I kind of like this interpretation of it being a puzzle for the listener to solve. And then the next song is called Soap, and this is a complete diva convention. I literally jumped out of my seat when I first heard it because the Rebecca Black sample is such an inspired decision. I have no idea who decided to do this, but like, wow, 3 queens joining together to maximize their joint slay. This was the crossover I didn't ask for, but definitely needed. Pink Pantheress is a great producer. She matches really well with Yves' voice. However, I think, in my unpopular opinion, is that I really much prefer the original song Sugar Water Cyanide, because I just love that song so much. I heard it first, and I think it is a track that is better on its own. So while Soap is a miracle that exists, every time I listen to it, it makes me just want to listen to Sugar Water Cyanide, the original. So at the time of writing this script, I wrote down that I'd love to see Pink Pantheress and Yves collab more often because their subtly experimental electronic approach to addictive pop music is so aligned that this duo is just too good to do one collab. And enough time has passed since I've written this script and when I'm filming it, so much so that it has been announced that Pink Pantheress is releasing her remix album and Yves is a feature on that album. So we will actually get to hear more of their collaborating. I wish it didn't take me this long to make this video, but I knew that they were too good of a team for it to just be the one song. At the time that I'm filming this is Wednesday, New Zealand Standard Time. So in about 2 days, we'll get to hear the album. So I really hope it goes well. And Kylie Minogue is in the track list. Anyway, let's pivot back to this album. I also like Aibo as well. I don't know how to pronounce it. I like this pop punk vibe brought to Yves' repertoire, and is pretty novel to have Yves collab with a non-English speaker for once. I wish Yves sang Korean lyrics in the song because I think it would have been really cool to hear the Spanish and the Korean lyrics together. It's not a combination that I've heard before, but I guess we're just singing English for this EP. In fact, there's very little Korean in this. The next 2 tracks is a little bit baffling. My friend brought up a really good point when we were discussing this EP, in that it felt paradoxical to market Yves as a kind of indie darling when all of the songs in the EP had been produced for her, especially as her role as the vocalist begins to taper off towards the end and the collaborations slowly taking up more space until eventually Yves' voice becomes an instrument through which the producer crafts these instrumental heavy songs. By the time we reach the track Study, we don't even get to hear Yves properly anymore. And I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing, it's just an observation. I'm not really a big fan of short songs. This EP has 6 tracks, but it only lasts 16 minutes. So my typical critique is that it's just too short to give it anything higher than Gems Found in the Mind. My favorite songs are White Cat, Aibo, and Mom. And then I listened to Little House by Rachenl Chinouriri. So Rachenl Chinouriri is a British indie pop singer who released her debut album in 2024 titled What a Devastating Turn of Events. I really enjoyed that album. I found it enough reason to keep an eye on her career. I like her voice. I like her vision. Little House is a short EP that she released in 2025. It consists of only 4 tracks. I thought this EP was just fine. While the melodies were pleasant, I didn't personally connect with the lyrics. I like Chinouriri enough that I would not hesitate to recommend her to others and find lots of praise and compliments for her work, but I do have trouble coming up with anything specific about this EP that if I were to recommend her to anyone, I would just tell them to go listen to the debut, because everything that she does in this EP, she does way better in the debut. So I can't help but feel like this is just a collection of tracks that she wanted to put out into the world rather than saying anything new or different to what she'd already said in her debut. So for that, I'm just gonna put this in the most album ever. And then I listened to Chaotic and Confused by Somi. Somi is a K-pop idol that debuted in 2016, originally in the K-pop girl group IOI, and then finally as a soloist in 2019. Chaotic and Confused is her second EP, with her last being released in 2023 that had Flash Forward, one of my favorite releases of that year. Flash Forward introduced a really fresh sound on Somi that excited the general public for her future and for her potential as a sleek EDM pop queen. The comeback single Closer makes good on that promise, as many of the listeners have made connections between Closer being the more mature take on the electro dance sound that Flash Forward introduced in 2023. The rest of the EP lives up to the title, as many of the tracks sonically are chaotic, and meanwhile in the lyrics she is very much confused. Most of the songs are about a relationship that wasn't healthy, or about a relationship that didn't work, or about Somi kind of wanting to go crazy and become freer. Escapade has a distinct new wavy sound that is heavily led by the bass line. Super surprising for a K-pop track, for Somi of all people as well. Extra is a really excellent take on 80s synth pop that features Somi's excellent delivery, fitting right in with the funky bass lines and glistening guitars. Then we have Chaotic and Confused, and this is a track that the EP borrows the title from, and I can see why this is chosen, because it basically holds the thesis within the song of being chaotic and kind of confusing, because it goes back and forth between different sounds. And then we've got Closer. The interpolation is very clever. It comes from Sean Kingston's Beautiful Girls. Very interesting song to sample. And while I liked it in my initial listen, like most nostalgic throwbacks, it does feel like a cheap trick to get the audience to halfway liking it. However, the rave elements in the song are really good, and I'd say that this song is not particularly indicative of the tone and thesis of the EP, but it does a really good job of hooking the listener into checking out the rest of the songs, which is all you can really ask for a single. Now, you could argue that Extra did this first, given that it's a little bit more in tune to the chaos and confusion that we see in the other tracks, but I'd say that Closer is a really good choice for a K-pop comeback single. It's got the fun pop elements to it, sleek and precise. And then finally, we've got Delulu. I find this to be one of the vocal highlights of the EP. Somi does a really good job of sounding sardonic and petulant and selling the story of being a scorned young woman. She does so well with R&B, so I have no surprises that she does really well in this track. Altogether, the EP feels cogent in the sense that all of the songs are about the same thing, but at the same time, they're pretty surface level concepts. There's no big story. There's no unique commentary about love or chaos and confusion, but at the same time, it feels relatable, contemporary, and attainable almost. All in all, it's competent and serviceable, and I like it enough to put it in French toast. I like all of the songs, but my favorite songs is probably Extra and Delulu. These are the songs where I think Somi's delivery really fits and sells that story of being played around by men who aren't shit. And then I listened to Caroline's self-titled album. So Caroline is an English rock band that formed in London in 2017. This is their debut album released in 2022. I discovered them because the band collaborated with Caroline Polachek on their latest 2025 single for their latest album, and I really enjoyed it. So I wanted to go listen to that new album, the one with Caroline Polachek, but before I do that, I kind of wanted to check out what their last album was like to see if there was a progression in their skills or in their messaging. However, before I allowed myself to listen to that album with Caroline Polachek, I gave into my habit of trying to place that album in its rightful context, where I would go back and listen to the album that came before that to better navigate what the new album is trying to tell me. And to be honest, I found this debut album really confusing. This album could not be any further away from the exactly one song that I had listened to. And the band overall has a very avant-garde approach to music that I found kind of difficult to enjoy. Not to say that the music is bad, it's just I found their approach so different to what I'm used to, and I just could not really wrap my head around the purpose of it all. Their approach seems to be fixating on individual specific textures and short bursts of sound, so the listener really has to focus on the sounds as they overlap, which feels like you are meant to kind of deconstruct what that would be like if they were layered on top of each other. So I appreciate the album for getting me to think about it, and that got me to consider how it is that music builds up upon each other. Like, you don't realize how much music builds up on top of each other until you strip it all back, and it's almost like a sandwich. What they've done is that they took a sandwich that had many layers, and then they took up one layer off at a time and lined them up in a single file, and then that becomes the song. That's how I would describe listening to this album. And I don't really know what the purpose of the genre is, but I can respect it. I didn't get it. That's totally fine. I didn't understand it. I did learn something, which is good. My enjoyment of this is, I would say, not very much. So I'm gonna put this in I learned something new. This did not deter me from listening to the next album, because now more than ever I'm curious about whether this is a sound that they're gonna continue into future projects. So, and then I listened to Unevermeet by Unevermeet. Unevermeet is the first subunit of idntt, which is a 24-member boy group under the South Korean music label Modhouse. idntt, or I Don't, is considered the male version of Triple S. This group will eventually debut 2 more subunits and then debut as a full 24-member group, similar to how Triple S did. Unevermeet is just the first to come out with their current 7 members. The group debuted on August 11, 2025. This album/EP has 7 tracks, but because they're all short, it has a runtime of 17 minutes. Modhouse is the label that manages K-pop groups like Triple S, Odd Eye Circle, and Artemis. Now, I will preface this by saying that I Don't, or Unevermeet, is another faceless boy group to me that I have very little attachment to. Not to say that I have way more attachment to their girl group label mate Triple S, but I'm just saying that in the sea of young idol groups, I really have no desire to get to know them better. I mostly listen to this so that I can kind of keep my finger on the pulse of the genre. I actually thought this EP was very well produced, but everything that could be praised is also what I want to criticize. I think the producers did a good job of making the group sound cohesive and belonging to the company through a brand of sound, similar to what they did with Triple S. It makes their sonic identity familiar, but distinct. Supposedly. I am curious as to how the label plans to continue to differentiate the group from their girl group labelmate, as well as the other boy groups that are debuting, how to sound like they are related but not enough that they cross-contaminate to the point of making both groups redundant. Triple S, I Don't, Artemis, and Odd Eye Circle are all part of the same company, and most of their music is produced by the company's in-house producers, or at the very least have a similar creative director. This contributes to the way that they all adhere to a specific sound style. However, at some point, I wonder whether making new groups at a breakneck speed is necessary if all of their demos are being shared around everyone else anyways, which is why I always appreciate when a company can recognize and act on the importance of a distinguishing identity, because K-pop groups hardly have anything new to say that doesn't already fit into the conventions of pop music. So what is the point if they all start sounding the same? Like, my reasoning is that wouldn't it just make more sense to give your existing artists more music? Because I feel like this desire to have 24 members on a group just feels like, I don't know, superfluous, not really necessary. And like, what is the point of having so many in one group if like you're gonna use their voices in the same way anyway? For example, in this EP, I find that the way that they've sung the songs feels like it's really hard to distinguish when one person stops singing and another one begins. So I'm like, why bother having 7 members or 24 members if you're all going to utilize their voices as if they are one person? So that's just like a critique that you can probably say about most K-pop companies, but I think specifically for this label, this shtick, this gimmick of having so many members, like the most members in that, a gimmick. Nothing really that serves the purpose of making the music more interesting. I can recognize that this EP is a competent piece of work, but I just didn't feel like it added anything new to my life. However, Mod House does have very good producers, and there is still an intriguing glimmer still. I don't know if I'm just gonna tire of them like I did with Triple S. At some point, the deluge of new music, indistinguishable from other people, and like not really giving enough time for the fans to get to know each member just feels like it's doing more harm than good. I'd be really curious to see what you feel if you are a Triple S fan, or if you are a fan of any other idol group that has many members like Triple S or I Don't do. Let me know in the comments like what you feel, whether this is a conversation that you guys have in your fandom, because I'm actually really quite curious now that I think about it. Circling back to this EP, I am just gonna put this in Gems Found in the Mind. I think they still do a pretty good job in terms of like a classic K-pop EP. I hate that it's so short, but it ticks all the right boxes, and even if I don't click necessarily with the individual songs, I feel like they still do a good enough job of being a K-pop EP that I can comfortably put it in Gems Found in the Mind. And then I listened to 6 Shots by Juye. This was an EP released in 2025. Juye is a South Korean singer who debuted independently in 2018 with her single Call Me Back. She has remained fairly underground, with mostly singles released here and there, and one studio album titled Smile Anthem released in 2023 with another artist named Huko. I found this EP through Spotify's algorithm. I was visiting my Discover Weekly playlist when one song from this EP turned up, and Spotify's algorithm can be pretty good when you know how to use it, because sometimes it can lead you to some pretty fruitful results, such as this EP. I really enjoyed 6 Shots. I think it's a perfectly pleasant set of songs. It's the perfect soundtrack to my commute during my rainy or cloudy mornings. Her voice is smooth and sweet. It's nothing too out of the box. It's a project that does what it sets out to do well. While you could argue that it's not particularly memorable or groundbreaking, The fact that I enjoyed it a lot is enough for me to put this in French toast. I have actually not listened to her other singles outside of this EP, but I am keen to dive deeper into her discography. My favorite song is Being Being, the original song that actually found its way into my Discover Weekly playlist. And then I listened to Lucky Styles by They Are Gutting a Body of Water. They Are Gutting a Body of Water is an American shoegaze band from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They released their first album in 2018 titled Gestures Bean. This is their third studio album released in 2022. If you zoom in a little on my tier list, you can see that I'd actually listened to Gestures Bean, the debut album, a few months ago, so I'm not going into this record too blind. Given that they are dropping a new album this year, I thought that I needed to inch closer to the end of their discography while I waited for that new album to drop. I find Lucky Styles to be a very easy listen. The project basically breezes by, and before you know it, it's over. There's no particular song that stands out to me, but the album itself is very replayable. I thought that their debut album Gestures Bean was pretty good. Despite the tracks that I didn't care for, I liked it enough to put it in French toast. However, I arguably like Lucky Styles more than that. Lucky Styles doesn't have the slowcore elements in Gestures Bean that I had originally found to be a slog to go through. So I think in order to make this make sense, I'm going to bump Gestures Bean down to Gems Found in the Mind so I can comfortably put Lucky Styles in French toast. And then I listened to Daydream by Mariah Carey. This was released in 1995. Mariah Carey is one of the most prolific vocalists in Western pop. I am continuing with my discography dive. I finished listening to Butterfly recently. So this album is categorized as adult contemporary, which I would love to do a deeper dive into as to what the genre's context is and its purpose is. I think the term adult contemporary is quite fitting because, as I understand the genre based on this album and other genres and other albums that I listen to that have also been classified as adult contemporary, that it just seems like it's an old term to refer to easy listening ballads that cater to a very wide demographic. Even the term contemporary just means like what is popular at that time. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, they have this term that effectively almost performs the same function as what the term pop music does right now, but not quite. I guess like the difference between adult contemporary and just like regular pop music would be like it's focused on vocals, a more maybe soulful or R&B influence, and definitely not as upbeat as pop can be. There's a certain je ne sais quoi about adult contemporary that makes it quite marketable to everyone. Although again, given the name, it clearly assumes that the consumers are going to be adults because at the time, only the adults really had that disposable income to be spending money on these types of CDs, not a younger audience. Although now it's quite hard to imagine given that the youths on TikTok are currently the drivers of trending audios and viral hits. The term adult contemporary can then feel like a time capsule of the tastes back then. So back to the album itself, I really enjoyed this, especially the first half. Fantasy is just a perfect pop song. It feels like I'm skipping down the street, hair tossed in the wind as I bounce along the concrete grounds, feeling free and feminine and beautiful, like the sun is shining. No wonder that's like one of the biggest singles of the album. Another big single of the album, which is a complete contrast, is One Sweet Day. I think there is something to be said about the juxtaposition of having Fantasy and One Sweet Day being singles of the album. One is like, you know, a daydream of, pun intended, of, you know, love and happiness and joy and like feeling good, whereas One Sweet Day is literally about death and grief, but so cathartic and so gentle with you. Like it really holds your hand as you're like weeping and you're like, you know, crying together and swaying to the music. With its themes of grief and loss best expressed through its gospel elements, it's incredibly kind to combat the heartlessness of death. Even before I looked it up, I had a feeling that the song had something to do with the AIDS epidemic because it was the only historical event that I was aware of that fit the timeline of the song. And so I think it's a testament to how well they wrote the song that I basically understood what it was written for even before confirming my suspicions. The song kind of straddles this line of platonic, romantic, and familial at the same time. That was the only event I could really think of that best captured that feeling of just overall sadness and loss. Overall, I would say I prefer Daydream slightly over Butterfly, but not enough to bump Butterfly down a tier. I think this is an excellent example of the difference between having a personal preference and then taking a more objective stance on an album's quality. Given that the albums are distinctly different genres and therefore following different conventions and rules, I feel like it's really difficult to, say that one is better than the other when they are both clearly doing different things. Daydream is clearly more focused on vocal ballads, putting emotional highs and lows and technical skills as the forefront. It does not have as much room for production, experimentation, and genre crossovers as Mariah Carey eventually does in her later career, and the album's eye is more pointed to the charts. It is a flavor of adult contemporary and R&B that a wide range of listeners can comprehend. The greatest example of this would be her cover of Open Arms by Journey, as opposed to her cover of Prince's song The Beautiful Ones in Butterfly. The choice in covers actually solidifies the genre that Mariah Carey is aiming for in each context, with rock ballads in Daydream versus R&B music with a more hip-hop edge in Butterfly. However, we do see glimmers of this hip-hop side in tracks like Long Ago, which has a bit of a hip-hop-ish beat, veering almost towards a trip-hop quality in some parts, which makes sense given the time that this album was released in the 90s. So as I mentioned earlier, I do prefer Daydream over Butterfly, but I will probably put them both in the same tier because I think the beauty of Mariah Carey is just her consistency to make solid, satisfying, excellently well-produced and well-performed music. My favorite songs are Fantasy, One Sweet Day, Open Arms, and Always Be My Baby. And then I listened to Virgin by Lorde. This was released in 2025. Lorde is a singer-songwriter from New Zealand. She debuted in 2013 with her world-shattering album Pure Heroine and followed it up with her sophomore album Melodrama, and the world was simply never the same again. I realized that I live in a post-Lorde world, which means I have to recognize the incredible impact she had in the world of alternative girls and pop girls. Everyone, all of them, live in the shadow of Lorde's songwriting and production and have to respond to the trailblazing production style she introduced to the world. And Lorde herself is not immune to the shadow cast by her own work. Given how long she was on hiatus for and the fact that her last project, Solar Power, in 2021 was not what her audience expected to hear, there was a lot riding in this new album. So this is her fourth studio album. The first single was called What Was That, very clearly melodrama-esque, which was a little disappointing to me, specifically because I was kind of hoping that she would further progress into the Solar Power era sound, but I think it did get everyone hyped up. I think I'm one of the very few that really liked and resonated with Solar Power, so the fact that when it was hinted that everyone was gonna get a sequel to Melodrama, they were a lot more excited than I was. Melodrama was a lot more existential and concerned with herself and her relationship to growing up and being older, whereas Virgin is really a response to various relationships that hurt her. I'm not super interested in analyzing what happened behind the scenes in regards to her possible alleged entanglement with Jack Antonoff, but many have pointed out that decided to work with a different producer just to go and replicate the sound she made with Jack Antonoff and decided not to work with him at all was an interesting choice that implied many things. I will not get too deep into this album, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected, given that I wasn't as excited about it as everyone else was. I really enjoyed her down-to-earth reflections. It felt way more relatable than Melodrama. I think Melodrama was a bit more like a firework, pretty, fiery, kind of intense, but far away. I am a very boring kind of person. I don't really relate to the intense lows and precarious highs that dictate much of Melodrama. Even the celebrity aside, I don't do, exciting drugs. I've never been in a relationship. But because Lorde is so introspective, she has the ability to act as a mirror to a girl who is also going through a messy time period. As I said, I probably have more to say about this album, but I don't want this video to be too long, and I just don't have the brain capacity to explain it right now. So I'm just gonna put this in French toast and leave it at that for now. My favorite songs are actually Favorite Daughter, David, and Hammer, but other songs that had a really strong thesis and a memorable story include Current Affairs, GRWM, and Clear Blue. I think they have a really strong thesis and a really memorable story, but I don't personally listen to them in my downtime. And then I listened to Closer to Closure by Hanbee. Hanbee is a Korean New Zealand musician that has been cultivating an image and following both overseas and here at home. She had debuted in 2021 with her first EP titled In or Out, and this is her second EP released in 2025. It pains me to admit this, but I wasn't particularly impressed with this EP. It's a bit too down-tempo for me and I wasn't very memorable. I am open to trying out another project from her before making a specific decision, but for now I'll put this in. I learned something new. And lastly, I listened to You Are the Moonlight by Aya Gloomy. Aya Gloomy is the stage name of Aya Yanase, and she is a Japanese pop artist. She debuted in 2018 with her first album, Riku no Koto. This is her second EP, released in 2025. I discovered this artist through the Spotify Discover Weekly playlist as well, because the algorithm rightly recommended the track 2-star, and I really enjoyed it. So obviously I went to go and listen to the rest of the EP. However, a little similarly to how the algorithm recommended me that song from Juye's EP, the algorithm did its job a little too well, and I quickly realized that 2-star is the only song in the entire track list that I specifically enjoyed, which isn't too surprising given how short the EP actually is, with only 5 songs in less than 15 minutes. Given all of Spotify's faults, it is always surprising to me whenever it does its job at all. The algorithm correctly pointing to which song from each EP I would like out of all of them accurately is actually quite impressive, if it wasn't for the fact that Spotify is the way that it is. But enough of that. I'm gonna put this EP in the most album ever. Even though I really liked 2-star, I don't like it enough to put it in Gems Found in a Mine, so I think it sits comfortably right in the middle. And that's all I listened to in August. In total, I listened to 12 projects with 5 albums and 7 EPs. So here is a pie chart of my listening activity so far in 2025. You'll notice that this blue section is just gonna get bigger and bigger because I am just gonna jam so much 2025 releases in the final months of the year that priority has basically dethroned any other album interest that I have. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought of the albums that I mentioned, whether you love them, whether you hate them, whether you agreed with my hot takes. If you want to see more of my work, you can subscribe. I post videos about music, books, films, and sometimes vlogs as shorts. All of my social media links are down in the description alongside my Patreon and Ko-fi pages if you want to support me financially. I don't have anything special in my Ko-fi pages, but in Patreon, I do have a few exclusive videos that are not available to the public. So aside from showing me support, you are also getting more things to watch. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good rest of the day. I look forward to sharing my love with you again next time. See you soon! Bye.